Good Wife, Wise Mother, a discussion of feminism in Japan. The traditional role of women in Japan. During the feudal period, a preference for male versus female children developed. A husband did not will possessions to his wife upon his death, rather to the next eligible male. Women were not allowed to work. A new marriage system developed. When a woman entered into her husband's household upon marriage, she and any children belonged solely to him. A woman was completely dependent upon father and then upon husband. The ideals of feminine virtue were service and self-effacement. A Japanese woman should be a good wife and a wise mother. A woman should never disfigure her face in anger. She should be diffident in speech, never presuming to be familiar with her husband. She must endure without complaint. The rule of the three obediences. Obedience to her father when unmarried, to her husband when married, and to her son when widowed. In the early 1900s, Japan made huge efforts to adopt Western technology and science. The growth of capitalism brought the advancement of bourgeois liberalism. Feminist theories became widely debated. After the Russo-Japanese War, Japan had established herself as a world power. The traditional ideals and status of woman was not in harmony with Japan's attempts at modernization. Although educational possibilities for women increased, the social position of Japanese women was hardly changed. Post-World War I. World War I dealt a death blow to the remnants of Japanese feudalism. Movements for equality became more pronounced. Japan's vigorous labor movement in the early 20s inspired a new era in the women's movement. Capitalism also brought about a new phenomenon, the working woman. Women who were increasingly more interested in their own working conditions and labor problems. The first Japanese feminists. Ichikawa Fusei. Her lifelong career in the women's movement began in 1919 with a position in the women's section of the labor organization. She was almost immediately asked by Hiratsuka Raicho to help organize the Shin-Fujin Kyoki, otherwise known as New Women's Organization, or SFK, for the purpose of raising the social and political position of women in Japan. Its goals were to obtain women's suffrage, establish equality with men, increase the speed of higher education for women, improve the position of women within the family, and provide welfare for working women. The New Women's Organization. New Women's Organization believed that women's suffrage would bring about the general emancipation of Japanese women on all levels of life. However, before addressing women's suffrage, they needed to address the Peace Preservation Law of 1887, which denied women many political privileges. This process was a long and difficult one. In their efforts to see Diet members about the reform issue, SFK women often waited for long periods of time at the Diet building, only to be refused admittance, and at times verbally insulted by the men there. The reform bill finally passed in April 1922, the first breakthrough in the long struggle to achieve women's rights. During this time, there were two developments of importance to the women's rights movement. The first, Japan was faced with a terrible overpopulation problem. In early 1920, a young Japanese woman, Ishimoto Kato Shizue, met Margaret Sanger during a visit to the United States. She was enthusiastic about Mrs. Sanger's ideas and became the leader of the birth control movement in Japan. The government's attempt to prevent Mrs. Sanger's entrance into the country in late 1920 only stimulated the growing Japanese interest in her theories. Mrs. Sanger's visit and the persevering work of Mrs. Kato to liberate women from excessive childbearing were extremely important in breaking down traditional attitudes that contributed to the subjugation of women. The second, the Great Tokyo Earthquake of 1923. This natural disaster encouraged greater interest in the women's movement and accentuated the important role of women in society, as women were crucial in relief and rebuilding efforts during this time. the Sino-Japanese War, July 7, 1937 to September 9, 1947. In 1937, Japan was fully at war with China, which changed the direction of the women's movement from suffrage problems to problems of working mothers, the care of their children, and establishing protective measures against venereal disease. Issues of mother and child welfare and protection gained momentum as often widowed women with no means of support committed suicide along with their children. This was the state of the women's movement in Japan at the outset of World War II. The war. Japan surrendered to the United States in August 1945. Then began a long period of American occupation in Japan from 1945 to 1952. This led to major reforms imposed by American authorities. Many of these changes had an effect on the status of women. One of the most significant structural changes was the 1947 Constitution. The enfranchisement of women was one of the most significant reforms of the occupation following World War II. Post-war. The 4 years of World War II were incredibly difficult and trying for the Japanese, and the last days were ones of immense destruction. After the war, there was every reason to expect that the government would grant women's suffrage in the new constitution, but the 30-year struggle was not over yet. In the last days of 1945, Ichikawa and Raicho gathered 40 women to form the Women's Post-War Policy Committee to ensure the revision of laws that were disadvantageous to women, and those which upheld the inferior position of women in Japan. On April 10, 1946, women in Japan voted for the first time. At the Second National Women's Day Conference in 1949, Ichikawa and Hiratsuka Raicho received honors as being women who had contributed most to women's suffrage. Does this mean equal rights? The 1947 Constitution forbade discrimination based on sex. It also stated that marriage shall be based only on the mutual consent of both sexes. Equal rights of both husband and wife are guaranteed. It also guaranteed that with regard to choice of spouse, property rights, inheritance, choice of domicile, divorce, and other matters pertaining to marriage and family, laws shall be enacted from the standpoint of individual dignity and the essential equality of the sexes. The failure of the women's movement to produce significant results for such a long time is essentially the result of Japanese feudalistic traditions. The family, as center of Japanese society, had defined rigid roles for men and women in order to maintain harmony within the social structure. Women now have almost complete equality with men under Japanese law. However, there are discrepancies in practice. Women still struggle for equality in the workplace and in the home. The extensive restructuring of Japanese state and society after 1945 affected conceptions of womanhood, including Ryosai Kenbo, the ideals of good wife, wise mother. But these sudden, fairly drastic changes did not relegate Ryosai Kenbo to the trash heap. Japan has had a continuing transformation of the women's movement with a strong revival in the 1970s and 80s to current times. Going forward. In summation, women have made much progress in achieving equality, but there is still much work to do.